Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Rupa Subramanya Show. I am Rupa Subramanya. My guest today is Joanna Williams. She's founder and director of the British think tank CHEO, which in Latin means to ignite, to spark, and to set in motion. Joanna is a weekly columnist for the online magazine Spiked and writes regularly for numerous other publications, including The Times, The Spectator, and The Telegraph. She's also author of the book How Woke Won, the elitist movement that threatens democracy, tolerance, and reason. Joanna was in the news here in Canada recently as she was due to speak at a public lecture organized by Canada's Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship on issues of gender identity and censorship. She was due to speak at the taxpayer-funded London Public Library in Ontario. But the library cancelled her event, thus exemplifying the concerns she raises in her book. The event is now scheduled for another venue. To talk about toxic woke politics, why her lecture in London, Ontario was cancelled, and her recent book, please welcome Joanna to the show. Welcome to the show, Joanna. It's great to have you here with me, I want to start by asking you to explain the circumstances behind why your talk at London Public Library was cancelled. What was your talk about? And if you could just walk us through what happened.
So it's the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship here in Canada that's hosting their annual lecture, and they very kindly asked me to come along and be the keynote speaker for this year's event. And I was thinking about academic freedom and what you can and can't say nowadays, particularly on a university campus, but I think in society more broadly. And it seems to me that the number one topic that is off limits for free speech is to do with sex and gender. Certain things that have become real taboos that you just can't say nowadays. So to say a woman is an adult human female, for example, to say that there's no such thing as a transgender child. I mean, it seems to me that this has become a kind of modern day blasphemy. You know, these are things that you just must not be allowed to say. So it seems like a good idea if you're talking about free speech, if you're talking about academic freedom, to actually let's have a discussion about where the limits are nowadays. So that's why I proposed the title of my talk should be Sex, Gender and the Limits of Free Speech. Traditionally, this talk is held at the public library because it's aimed to get a bigger audience than just university students and professors. And to me, this seems like such an important idea, fundamental to democracy, that you've got a taxpayer-funded library, universities, which are also heavily subsidized, and you should, I think, want to bring debates out to the public to involve more layers of people in a debate. But London Public Library, clearly didn't see it that way, and they wanted background information about me. They wanted a transcript of what I was going to say, and having run various background checks, having pushed this through their committees, they clearly decided that I wasn't a suitable speaker, and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship couldn't host their annual lecture at the library.
Incredible. And did they tell you why your talk was being canceled? Why they were not going to give you that space?
Well, they have done, but it's annoying because they do these things in very cowardly ways, I think. I think if they were really, truly confident of the moral ground that they were taking, I think they would be very open about the reasons. Whereas these people, they tend to obfuscate behind bureaucracy, behind policies, and they'll point to various policy documents that they think you're breaching, which is really their way of saying, of not saying we've made a political decision that we don't like these views. They'll refer you to policy document A subsection B, bullet point 10. And basically they're trying to accuse me of being dangerous, potentially, a risk of physical violence, they say, and also sexual harassment, which kind of really takes the biscuit, all of them I find utterly bizarre. I mean, in my day-to-day life, I'm a middle-aged mum of 3, I'm an ex-academic myself. I write books and papers. The idea that I pose a physical threat to people, it's kind of laughable if it wasn't so serious.
No, it is. And, we chatted a bit before we started recording, and this is your first time in Canada. And so it's unfortunate that this was your experience, your initial experience with the country. And we'll get to that a little later, because I really want to talk about how Canada stacks up against the UK, for example, or even Western Europe for that matter, in terms of cancel culture and wokeism. We'll get to that in a bit. But you wrote in your Spiked column, so you're also a weekly columnist for Spiked Online. I've had the great pleasure of writing for them as well once, and a publication I grew up reading, actually, and you've been warning about censorship, and you just got censored, and how deeply ironic is that? And that too at a public library of all places, which should be a venue for open debate, but clearly that wasn't the case here. What does this event tell us about where we are at right now, the state of these culture wars?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is something that is disguised by this hiding behind policies, that this is actually a very political decision. I mean, it really is, as far as I'm concerned, a culture wars decision that's been made here. And I think anybody who doubts that needs only to look at the fact that this very, very same library, the London Public Library, they host drag queen story hours. They're very, very happy to run events like that, where a drag queen comes in and I would argue essentially preaches gender ideology to children who are far too young to be able to offer a reasoned critique or even know what it is they're being subjected to. Now, I could understand, I wouldn't agree, but I could understand if a public library said, we're funded by taxpayers, we think it's important to remain politically neutral, so we're not going to get involved. So they would say no to me, and they would also say no to the drag queens. And I wouldn't agree with that. I think in the interest of free speech and facilitating debate, they should have these people there, but I would agree with it. I could understand why you could make such a claim. I think either you say, if you're a taxpayer funded public body, you either say political neutrality means no one is speaking, or you say everyone is speaking and everyone has equal rights to speak. The drag queen can have an hour, I can have an hour. Whereas instead, by saying the drag queens can speak, they can talk about gender ideology, but I can't talk about sex-based rights and censorship, they're essentially taking a side in what is a very heated, I would say probably the most important debate of our time. The library is very publicly taking one side of that debate, and not only are they taking one side, but they're kind of trying to pretend that they're not, by just resorting to pointing at policies and documents. So it's cowardly and it's biased and it's one-sided, and it's very definitely the culture wars. But as always, the people who I think launched the culture wars, they then sit back and deny that they're doing any such thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect segue actually to talk about your book, which I've just started reading it, and and I want you, would like you to tell us about the impetus behind your book, how woke won, the elitist movement that threatens democracy, tolerance, and reason. I'd like everyone listening to get a copy of the book. It really is quite a riveting read so far. What is the main argument you're making in the book, Joanna, and why do you think this book was necessary?
Yeah, so the argument I wanted to make was really just point out how pervasive this woke thinking is now amongst an elite section of our society. So I think this is the case really across the globe, that the people who are most powerful in our cultural institutions, so across the media, across universities, schools, libraries, we now see museums, art galleries, all the cultural institutions in our society, they've been essentially captured by a group of people who all share the same political outlook. And it's this very elitist, but very kind of backward, I think, very regressive ideology that tries to present itself as being just a kind of nice variation on political correctness, but is actually anything but. My big concern about some of these movements is that it's actually rehabilitating sexism, racism, homophobia, all of these things that I've been involved in fighting against all my life, and now coming back under this kind of guise of niceness and kindness, and they're coming back with the people who are running these institutions, who are then ruling out all debate and all discussion on what it is that they're actually doing. And I kind of wanted to write a book just to expose what's going on, trying to point out to some of the people in charge themselves, look, you are in a powerful position, because don't they try to deny it? I think they often try to present themselves as victims when they're actually very powerful people, and try and point out some of the problems with this ideology that has become so dominant in our society.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as you point out, it's one of the deep ironies is that, of the people who are putting out this woke agenda out there, are some of the most privileged members of society, whether they're in politics, culture, academia, or business. And I believe in your book, you say that this is a way for them to insulate their privilege while appearing virtuous. Can you explain how this works exactly?
Well, I mean, just thinking of an example off the top of my head. So walking around in Toronto today, I was a bit lost and found myself in the financial district. And the only way I knew it was the financial district is because the lampposts have got little flags which kind of tell you, this is the financial district.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why I only knew because of that was because the windows of all of the kind of bank fronts, the financial centres, shop fronts, if you like, are all covered in rainbow flags. So clearly everyone's gearing up for Pride Month, and these are, forget even culture for the time being. These are the financial. This is the financial district. These are economically incredibly powerful, wealthy institutions employing high-paid, wealthy, elite people, and they're absolutely bedecked, not just in rainbow flags, but it's the kind of the pink and the blue and the brown to be the kind of the ultra inclusive pride flag. And you just think, if this movement was truly radical, if it was something that was truly going to upturn the kind of present social status quo, it wouldn't be being adopted by banks and elite institutions, and it wouldn't be so readily and so easily taken on board by all these elite institutions. And the fact that they can take this on board so easily, and are so desperate almost to be seen to be having these rainbow flags and to be bedecking themselves in this, sets alarm bells ringing with me, and it says this is not all it's cracked up to be.
So why this issue? Why is much of the Western world, and especially here in Canada and the U.S., what is it about this particular issue about trans, the trans agenda that has gotten every one of these elite institutions on board? Why are people so passionate about it when there's tons of other things that you could be fighting for? There are so many legitimate issues out there that require attention. But why this? I've been trying to grapple with this question, and I don't really have an answer to it.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's a really fundamental question, and I wish I could say I had the definitive answer. I'd be lying if I said I do. But I think for me, it gets to the most fundamental premise about what makes us human, and on the basis on which we structure our society. So what I mean by that is that being kind of male or female is absolutely the most fundamental characteristic that cuts across social class, it cuts across racial lines, it cuts across every other part of our identity. It's something that parents often learn when the mum's still pregnant. It's the first thing that the doctor says when we appear in the world. So it's absolutely the most crucial thing as to what makes us human. And beyond that, it forms the basis for how we organize society. A lot of civilized societies have kind of girls' toilets and boys' toilets in schools. Changing rooms, prisons, hospitals are often segregated along sex-based lines. But also it gets to the very heart of family life. Families are still, probably be criticized for saying this, but it's just a truth that families are still most often a male and a female parent, and they raise children acting as mum and dad become role models for the children, become sex-based role models. Daughters kind of grow up seeing mum and emulating mum. Boys grow up seeing dad. And it doesn't mean obviously they become carbon copies, but this is the most fundamental part, I think, of what makes us human, of how we organize society, how we organize family life. So I think if you've got some kind of political project which wants to completely upturn everything we take for granted about humanity, about society, you really want to kind of have a blank piece of paper and start from scratch, then actually going for what we mean by human sex is not a bad place to start from their point of view. And that, I think that's probably one reason why this has become such a central issue.
And that too, really, in the West, right? And even within the Western world, it's a few countries, and so I wonder what's happening. Like, if you take countries like India or China, is this issue really resonating there in the same way? I mean, they're not. Are these cultural wars taking place there? Not to my knowledge. But this is all we seem to be talking about here, especially here in Canada. So, is there something happening here that is uniquely different in terms of identity, maybe lack of institutions, maybe I'm just trying to come up with some explanation for why it's so big here and not as big outside the Western world.
I mean, I think people, like say, who want to challenge the family, want to challenge the social structures that we have latched onto this issue. And I think in them doing that, it's become almost a litmus test. It seems to me. So where you stand on this particular issue really says the extent to which you are old-fashioned. You could be written off as old-fashioned for still saying you believe that a woman is a biological human female. It's, are you with us or are you against us? And this becomes the ultimate test, it seems to me, for where you stand, not just on this particular issue, but across a whole range of issues. It becomes a kind of sorting hat, for which side of this culture war you land upon. And you can see it's also becomes a way of compelling people to fall in line. So again, something else I noticed just walking around Toronto today, in the station and many of the public places, they have sculptures or artworks, and then they have a little piece of writing about the artist, and they always say the person's name, and then immediately in brackets afterwards, she, her. And I've not noticed that in England quite so much, but I definitely noticed it in Toronto. And I think, again, it's this test that you go along with, you subscribe, and you can use it then to compel, bosses can use it to compel workers. You must display your pronouns on a badge. You must put your pronouns in your signature, which sends a message that, you can't assume someone's gender. They have to fall in line with this. And it would be, it would be unthinkable for a boss to compel their workers to wear a crucifix, for example, or to have to wear a turban or some other kind of religious symbol. And yet it's seen as quite legitimate for bosses to compel workers to have to wear a pronoun badge or include pronouns on an email signature. So I think it serves a lot of advantages for the people who are in charge of society or in charge of these cultural institutions to really go for it with this issue.
Yeah. We frequently encounter criticisms of woke narratives, particularly around gender, from the small c conservative side of the aisle. Roughly speaking, people who uphold traditional values when it comes to the definition of what a man or a woman is. But it's also interesting that there's criticism from the left as well, at least from two different quarters. You have the feminists and you have the Marxists. Some feminists on the left are highly critical of the current gender narrative that endangers the position of women by denying who we are, and then the Marxists would argue that debates about gender and sexuality take away from discussions of class struggle and allow the woke elite to retain all their privileges. What do you think of these criticisms? Do you, and in some sense, you think that these are allies in the. Do you have some sympathy for these criticisms coming from the left?
Yeah, no, completely, I do. And I think it's really, really important that these are heard. I know that Britain has a reputation internationally for being, and I'm sure our listeners will have heard of this kind of tough island, is the nickname, which kind of makes me laugh. But I'm also very, very proud of that. And I think Britain, probably far more than Canada and America, has seen pushback against a number of these policies in various different areas, which doesn't mean to say for one second that the battle's won, or that this is all over, or that there aren't still victories being scored by the other side. But there is, I think, a lot of opposition to gender ideology in the UK. And I think the reason for that is because it is not a party political issue. Most, I would say, of the opposition to gender ideology in the UK does come from the left, particularly comes from feminists. On the point you're making about Marxists, at one point in my youth, I would have called myself a Marxist as well. And one of the central tenets that I took from Marxism was a belief in material reality, in contrast to the critical theory I was getting when I was at university at the time. An actual belief in the existence of material reality was an important principle of Marxism, and you don't get much more real than biology, as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah. I think these criticisms, I think it's vitally important that they're heard, because I think the problem in some other countries is that when the only criticism of gender ideology comes from the right, or small c conservatives even, it becomes far too easy for this to be then written off as a right-wing kind of cause, a right-wing cause célèbre. And that, I think, silences other critics who don't want to, people who are perhaps a little bit cowardly, or just a bit nervous about being associated with that label of being right-wing.
Yeah, no, and I wonder what the final question for you, Joanna. What is the best strategy for those of us who want to restore common sense and tolerance for different points of view? How do we push back against this, incredibly corrosive and damaging narrative, a woke narrative, which marginalizes and cancels anyone who disagrees with them? What is the way forward in this fight?
Well, to come kind of full circle from where we started this conversation, I do think free speech is absolutely the most vital principle, because this is the way that the woke cultural elites win, is by trying to put a discussion completely beyond debate. And the more we insist that these things are not put beyond debate, that we do have free speech, that we are allowed to talk about these issues, it allows us to shine the kind of the spotlight of a disinfectant, on this issue, and actually let people open it up to democratic accountability, let people in, let people have a say. And the more you do that, the more you let kind of ordinary people, to use a horrible phrase, have a say on these issues, the more the elites come up against a big shock, which is that people are not on board with these ideas. And this is why I kind of toyed with the title of my book a lot, How Woke Won, because it's won in the sense that it's been taken on board by a cultural elite, the people running our institutions, but I really don't think it's one in the sense of being taken on board by a majority of the population. And I think the problem is the cultural elite want to keep the majority of the population out of the discussion. They'd like just to rule us out of the picture altogether. So I think the more we insist on free speech, the more we insist on democracy and democratic accountability, then the woke cultural elite will have to take account of the fact that they failed. Where they failed is in convincing the regular people on the street that their views are right. And that's the irony, if you like, about the censorship that they're enforcing. They're not convincing anybody by this censorship. They're just putting the topic beyond debate, which doesn't actually win the argument for them in the long run. It just means the debate can't be had out right now.
So do you find yourself generally optimistic about this fight? I mean, are has wokeism peaked as such, and that the pendulum is going to be shifting back? I sometimes feel very pessimistic, and I'm not seeing that at all. But there are days I feel optimistic about it. What is your general sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely the same. I change hourly. Sometimes I feel very optimistic, sometimes I feel very pessimistic, and it's very, very hard to say who's won. The only thing I would say, was that if woke people were truly confident in their own arguments, they wouldn't be resorting to censorship. I see censorship as a sign of weakness. Like I say, it means they perhaps win the battle in the short term, but they don't win the war that way. If they were truly confident, they would say, we have the best arguments. We will have this debate with anybody who wants to come because we are so confident that we can beat you hands down. We can have these arguments and we can win because we're so persuasive. We're so convinced we're right. Every time I hear about someone being platformed or, articles being pulled from newspapers or some type of censorship, it actually does make me, it's infuriating, first of all, but then it makes me think, well, you are so cowardly. You didn't dare let people have that argument out in public because that your own arguments do not stand up to scrutiny. And so I guess in a funny kind of way, that does actually make me a little bit optimistic.
Well, yeah, I'm hoping that there is some common sense that is restored in the debate, and I hope that happens sooner rather than later. But Joanna, thank you so much for joining me, for coming on the show, and for sharing your thoughts with us. And again, I apologize that on behalf of those people who canceled you, this is not the Canada that I fell in love with when I came here many years ago, and it's certainly changed since I've been here, and it's unfortunate what happened to you, but I hope that you've also received a lot of support in the wake of this of you being canceled by London Public Library, and I wish you all the best, and good luck with your talk on Friday.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.